Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for January 28th, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by Jim Clausing, and I'm John Hogoboom, of course. So the first story that we're going to touch on today is related to, I guess, probably very recently, within the past couple of days or so, a story broke about the Extreme Remote Administration Toolkit, or better known as a RAT, being used in a targeted spearfishing campaign against the Israeli Ministry of Defense, or I think it's actually called their Civil Administration Department is what they call it. So, you know, we've talked about this type of thing before in the past. Extreme RAT, I don't know if we've actually touched on that one. But it's similar to some of the other ones out there that we've talked about in the past that are using these type of targeted spearfishing campaigns where they want to deploy these remote administration Trojans on your machine, and then they use them to remotely control them to either steal sensitive information and whatnot. Extreme's very much like Poison Ivy in functionality. Poison Ivy we've talked about before. The interesting thing, I think, about this one is that the Extreme RAT, we don't see, personally, I don't see as much of this being used as some of the other tool sets. It might just be the visibility into what we see in general. But the interesting thing in my mind is that this is not the first time that the Israeli government has been targeted by Extreme RAT. You know, so whoever has been targeting them, I want to say last year, probably in September, maybe it was even more than a year ago, I can't remember. But there was another spearfishing campaign, very similar in nature, that used Extreme RAT as the payload. This one used, they basically used a PDF document in an email, and if you open that PDF, it leveraged an exploit to drop the Extreme RAT Trojan on your machine. The previous one, whenever that was, either sometime last year, I can't remember exactly when, that targeted the Israeli government as well. That used a Word document, so similar techniques. And we see that a lot, where they use, Microsoft Word documents or Excel also we've seen, as well as PDF as a means to deliver the remote access Trojan onto the machine. So just something to be aware of. If you it would be good. I know there's some signatures out there for Extreme RAT in terms of, IDS type signatures that you can probably deploy if you have that type of technology in your environment to detect any kind of command and control activity related to that. So that might be a good one to go look at. And interesting story. It's not certainly the first time we've seen this type of thing before, but it's always a good reminder that there are actors like this out there. And depending on what your business is and what types of intellectual property you might have, you might be a target for this type of thing. Believe it or not, more people than not. You don't have to be a big, government agency for a nation. There are lots of businesses and corporations that have intellectual property that's important to them. And the bad guys know that, and they try to target you to steal that information so that they don't have to do all the legwork and research in order to develop that themselves.
Right. That's one of the keys. It's not just the big guys that are going to be the targets of this. The bad guys can find ways to make money off targeting just about anybody.
And there's all types of different threat vectors around that. We've also talked about the point of sale stuff back with the Target and some of those other things towards the last half of the previous year. And I don't really consider that advanced persistent threat type stuff in general, but it is a more advanced type of malware, specifically targeting things. So those are that's a whole kind of new area, and maybe I shouldn't say it's new, but it's probably new in terms of getting ink, in terms of getting press and in front of people's faces to know, hey, this is out there. People are, targeting, inside specific retailers and whatnot to try to get the credit card information and whatnot.
Yeah, it's getting more visible. That's certain.
All right. So you had a story, Jim, that you were looking into about tracking malware in a little bit of a new way, a little spin or twist on that?
Yeah, Mandiant did a blog post end of last week that they entitled "Tracking Malware with Import Hashing," and as a malware analyst for quite a while now, one of my interests has always been, trying to group malware samples into families to try to track, the malware written by the same authors, malware families that way. And there have been some techniques that folks used with varying amounts of success over the years. But Mandiant posted this blog article last week describing one particular technique, which was similar to something that I had been looking at for a while now, but hadn't cleanly implemented, and it turns out they've got a good implementation, so now I'll just use theirs and stop working on what I was working on. But basically, what they do is they look at the import tables of the Windows executables, the PE import tables. But it turns out that if you look at the import table and the order in which imports are done and which particular libraries are imported from which certain system DLLs, you can develop a fingerprint that is somewhat unique to a particular actor. They'll tend to use the same technique to accomplish things, and even if they try to do some obfuscation, reorder things, and so forth, you can still get a fingerprint out of the way the imports show up in the import table. And they submitted some code to Aero Carrera's PE file. It's a Python library that a lot of us use in analyzing Windows executables, and basically by comparing these imp hashes, the import hashes, you can get a good feel for whether or not two different malware samples may have been written by the same actors. So it's a nice technique, and I'm glad that they shared their code with the community out there, and so I figured I'd let some other people know about it. I haven't yet started including these imp hashes in the reports that I generate when I analyze malware samples, but I'm going to start doing that here in the next few days and add it to my script. So.
Yeah, I took a look at this as well, and I'd recommend everybody watching take a read over of this article. It's very interesting, especially if you're either a malware analysis person where you analyze malware and break it down, because it'll make a lot of sense to you what they're doing, and or if you're a defender. So if you're trying to detect malware in your company's enterprise and whatnot, this is an interesting technique, and I suspect, I think Mandiant even said that they didn't really invent this necessarily, this technique, but I would suspect that a lot of your antivirus vendors probably do something similar, or at least I would hope so.
Yeah, the Mandiant post there did reference a paper by FireEye that I think is more than a year old now, where FireEye had used a technique like this to cluster samples to track a particular APT actor, as I recall.
Right. And really what they're doing here is they're leveraging the fact that, these actors who write this code, they have their source code, they tend to reuse it, and we know that looking at APT samples, even regular kind of run-of-the-mill malware samples have a lot of reuse of the source code. And the order in which that source code specifies, okay, I'm going to import this library, I'm going to import this library, and this really gives it kind of a fingerprint. That's what they're looking at here. Interesting technique, and I guess the one thing I would worry about is, okay, now that the bad guys know that the defenders are doing this type of analysis, they can kind of shuffle around how they do some of their operations. in their actual source code, maybe to kind of trick people or trick this type of detection or hashing.
Yeah, they can do some of that, but they still want to call their Internet Open A and Internet Connect A and all of that kind of stuff, and so they'll still have to open the DLLs, import the routines from the DLLs. In some of that they can reorder, but some of it you've got to do in a certain order. So
right.
There may be some of that, but I think this can be a useful technique for grouping malware samples together into families and tracing the actors. So.
Right. And you had mentioned in the past there have been some other techniques. When you're talking about it, immediately came to mind was SSDeep, which is kind of an older algorithm that people used to try to use to kind of determine if certain malware or certain binaries had similarities in them. And I'm not so sure. That worked in some occasions, but not all of them. And so I think this might be another technique that might even surpass that one.
I still use SSDeep a lot, but there are some ways around that, and so using that in combination with this technique, I think, is a stronger way of grouping them together.
Right. And while we're on the subject, a little congratulations, in my opinion, of the Mandiant and FireEye merging acquisition. I'm not quite sure how to, in any event, one or the other, they're kind of joining forces together as one company. And I think that's going to be a really good marriage of two real powerhouses in certain spaces. So congrats to them. So I'll be interested to see how that comes along, that new company, in the upcoming year here.
Yep.
So you had another quick story on shape-shifting software. I didn't really, wasn't quite sure I got the whole gist of this one, but what do you know?
Yeah, this one actually was recommended by one of our editors, and we do welcome story ideas from our viewers. So you'll give the email address later on, but this one came to us. Found it on the BBC's website, a blog post there about a company called Shape Security, and so they're doing what they call shape shifting. Essentially, we've seen polymorphic malware in the past, where each time a new system gets infected, they do some polymorphism on the executable so that you can't use signatures to track it so much. Well, the idea here was to try to use that technique kind of against the bad guys as a protection against some sorts of SQL injection and cross-site scripting attacks where they go after particular forms on a web page and look for particular fields in a form. Basically, what these guys are doing is they're introducing something so that on each page view, the form action tag will be a different string that it then translates to the script, and the other tags, the form fields, they put randomly generated strings in there for each page view. They get a different one. That makes it that much more difficult for the bad guys to script their attack against the particular web page based on knowing the form fields. So it was an interesting technique. They say in the article there that it won't necessarily stop the bad guys; it'll slow them down. They need to get a better field for it. But the bad guys will probably find a way around even this technique eventually. But I thought it was kind of cool that we've seen the bad guys using the polymorphic malware against us. So now it's a chance to try to turn the tables a little bit and do some polymorphism on the web server side to try to confuse the bad guys.
So is this some kind of like appliance that sits between your web server and then the user, and it does this translation, or how does that actually happen? Did they say?
It wasn't clear. I think it's actually some software on the web server itself. I don't think it's an appliance that sits in front. I think it's software on the web server itself. But that much wasn't entirely clear just from this, and I didn't do any more research than just this article. But.
Okay. That's an interesting technique. Certainly if you can obfuscate or change the HTML every time it gets to a client, then it'll work fine for someone who's just manually browsing the web page like a real person would be. But a script that's trying to expect certain form fields and certain names is not going to be able to do that if it's always changing. So interesting technique. I guess we'll see how that works out for them. So let's move on to the Internet Weather Report. And there's a few things here to talk about this week. Nothing earth-shattering. The first one that kind of came to light is I kind of noticed that there's been this increase, persistent increase in SSH port 22 TCP scanning. So this is a 45-day picture, and you'll notice that probably starting around, I'm going to say January 8th, January 9th, there's been kind of this steady upward trend in the amount of scanning activity going on against that port. It's not one that I guess I shouldn't say not. It's one that we frequently see scanned because SSH is one of those ports that allows interactive administrative access to a device. So it's frequently being targeted by scanners and brute forcers who are trying to repeatedly guess passwords against those SSH servers and whatnot. But just an observation that it's definitely on an upward trend where, we were kind of seeing maybe a noise floor of 30 million scan packets per hour or something around there. I'm just eyeballing it here if you look at an average type of thing. But nowadays, the valleys are kind of trending upwards here. Such that you're looking at maybe a 70 million or something on an average, or for a low almost. So if you have a SSH exposed to the internet on any of your servers that you have, you might want to, we always recommend only allow, try to filter it so that only certain address blocks can access that need to administratively access that device. And I would certainly recommend that you have extremely strong password security in place on all of those, and audit your passwords on those systems so that users don't set up stupid, easy-to-guess passwords. Because that's typically how these devices, they're not usually broken into because of a weakness in the SSH protocol or a bug. It's more that they're brute forced into due to simple passwords that are being used.
If you're using it for servers and that kind of stuff, consider using public key only or adding two-factor authentication. There was a good article on the Internet Storm Center, I think it was back in December, on how to turn on two-factor authentication using the Google Authenticator with SSH on a Linux box. So.
Oh, okay, interesting. All right, so that's another good, some other good points there that you should consider if you're running SSH. On a related note, so on the unencrypted side, very comparable type of protocol, Telnet, we see this scanned all the time as well, but there has been quite a bit more in the past day or so, I'm going to say. So this is really within the past 24 hours. There's been a very large coordinated amount of scanning going on 23 TCP here. I didn't get a chance to look at what sources are involved in this activity. Generally speaking, though, in terms of the targets they're looking for here, most people aren't running Telnet unless it's some type of embedded appliance a lot of times. So like your DSL modem, or a lot of people have these security camera DVR systems that they expose to the internet and whatnot. it's a lot of those embedded types of appliances with embedded Linux on them that have Telnet turned on for administrative purposes, and generally speaking, that's what we see the actors in this particular space looking for. Those are the kinds of things that you may or may not be aware that they actually have Telnet open to the world. So if you're not sure, you might want to take a look and audit what you actually have exposed to the internet and see, if you have something like this open. Because again, this is the type of thing where they're going to do brute force password guessing against it.
Yeah, it's always a good idea to know what you've got open to the internet. Run an Nmap scan against yourself with permission, of course.
Right.
Just because the bad guys will find it, so it's a good idea for you to know what they are going to find.
Right. Absolutely. So then we had another one here, and actually, did I? No, I didn't say on that last one. So this is, I don't really know what this port is or why someone's scanning it, but we've seen a fair amount of coordinated scanning against port 1777 TCP. I don't think it has anything to do with the Revolutionary War or 1776, but it's actually assigned to something called Power Guardian, which is, that's the official assignment for this port, but I suspect that's not really what they're looking for here. Power Guardian was a UPS, backup UPS type provider once upon a time. I don't think they're in business anymore. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think that I don't think that that's what's happening here. There's probably something else that they're looking for, but I'm not quite sure what. In terms of primary sources scanning for this, it's coming mostly from China, and it's pretty coordinated. They're looking, they've got a few devices at a time going scanning address blocks at the same time. So it's definitely someone coordinating these scans. And then there's another one. This is not quite sure what to make of this, but there's a group of sources in China that I noticed. First of all, I noticed, okay, what is 9797? And it's the EMC2 Legato Networker, which is a backup piece of software that used to be Sun Solstice Backup Manager, I think. And when I looked at who was scanning this, there was a few sources involved in this in China. But then I noticed that they're actually scanning a whole bunch of things. So why they're scanning for these specific ones, can't really say for sure, but let's go through it. So there's port 81, 8081, and 8001. These are likely they're scanning for something HTTP related. A lot of times those ports are involved in administrative web access to devices when they are in that range. So a lot of times 80 is what the users would connect to, and 81 is an administrative port. Same thing with 8081 and 8080 being the normal port and whatnot. So that's my guess is what they're scanning for here. Port 9000 they're also scanning. There's some types of web services that run on port 9000 for administrating certain types of web front-end software. But also I noticed that the Hadoop name node uses that as a default port as well. And Hadoop is kind of a large distributed file sharing type of thing. Anyway, could be scanning for that as well. And then there's another port here, 10001, that they're also scanning for, which is well known as the SCP config port. I don't really know what that means, but that's what it's the assigned port. So I'm not quite sure what they're looking for. Long story short, one thing, I've kind of pointed this out before, you can kind of notice some patterns here. Whenever I see this type of pattern here, so let's look at this light green section here, where you've got 1, 2, a third spike that's kind of thicker, and then 3, 4 spikes, and then kind of a big little hill down here, or a small little hill at the bottom here. That is usually when we see somebody scanning the internet from 0.0.0.0 all the way to 255, 255. So they're sequentially scanning the entire internet, through the entire IP4 address space. And you'll notice here's the same exact fingerprint again in pink, where they did. I think this is the port 9000 they were scanning at this time. You can see that's that same 2 spikes, a little thicker one, 2 more, and then the little hill at the end. I believe there might even be some other ones. Well, this yellow one as well here, but it's kind of obscured because it's got another one underneath it, port 8081. So, there's periods of where they're scanning the entire internet for these ports. and then maybe some more targeted scanning in certain address blocks otherwise. If you're running anything listening on these ports, you probably want to be careful. If anything, I would think probably only these 80 ones here would be ones that people would be likely to have running for any reason. But, again, check your environment in case you have any of that type of stuff running. So here's the breakdown of the top most probe ports. So these are if we look at the entire realm of people scanning and what they're scanning the most for, not necessarily how many people are doing the scanning, but in terms of just raw scan packets. This is what we see mostly. And the one thing that did kind of jump out at me here, and this is why I looked at this one more in particular earlier on, is 22 TCP is at the top of the pile for yesterday. This is only really yesterday's counts of what we saw as a distribution. That's interesting. I don't think we normally see that bubbled up to the very top wedge, so to speak. So that's an interesting finding. And like we said, we've been seeing some increased activity on a steady incline here. So that's one to make note of. 445 TCP, that's, your config or other infections trying to exploit. There's a couple of different exploits against 445 TCP. And there's a few botnets and worms that scan for that on a frequent basis. 80 TCP could just be scanning in general for web servers that are open for either exploitation or other means. 3389 is remote desktop protocol, which we talk about all the time. Very similar in functionality, even more robustly so than SSH and Telnet. This gives you basically a whole interface to the Windows front end of the machine. So that's another one you definitely want to have protected. There are a few worms out there that scan on 3389 TCP and try to brute force their way in. So don't just assume that, make sure you have very strong passwords if you're going to open this up to the internet, anything running the remote desktop protocol. And I would also additionally mention, you want to filter, so that only those people who need to get access to those devices are allowed to. Don't open it up wide to the entire internet. Microsoft SQL Server we see here a lot. That could be scanning. There's some worm activity involved with that as well. And then we have these 16,000 range ones, which we know as the zero-access botnet. Talked about that quite a bit. And some 53 UDP in here. This could be people looking for DNS reflection nodes, or it could actually be some kind of backscatter-related stuff from DNS amplification attacks that occur in our data here. We've talked about that quite a bit as well. If you run a DNS server that's facing the internet, you might want to go take a look and see if it's being used for reflection or amplification attacks. If so, we've talked previously, there's been some updates to DNS and from Bind. You might want to make sure you have those patches put in place. Additionally, they had added some throttling mechanisms in there to help anybody who might be, subjected to a DNS amplification attack, helps control anybody's ability to use your DNS server as a reflection node.
The one thing that I do notice from that is that the NTP stuff that had been up there the last couple of weeks from those amplification attacks seems to have dropped down, so that's a good sign.
Yes, that is a good sign, and that has kind of curtailed quite a bit since about maybe the middle of last week, I would say. I probably could get a chart for that next time, and we can take a look. It's been kind of on the downswing. There's a lot of people that have been addressing this, people who have NTP resolvers out there to mitigate that option that allows for that monolith query that will reply with a big packet response. So that's helped dramatically in terms of controlling this type of, these devices from being used in reflection attacks. So in terms of the most sources probing, this is how many people we see probing these various ports, and how many of those basically is reflected here. So again, you're always pretty much going to see 445 TCP up here because in terms of the most number of sources scanning, yes, there's lots of bots out there, a lot of configure bots still out there scanning for this, believe it or not, even though it's pretty much been under control, so to speak, in terms of the command and control for a long time. But there's still a large number of contractor bots and whatnot, most of them orphans, that are out there just trying to scan for other machines to infect. Some of this stuff's probably backscatter type activity, these ICMP things, I'm going to guess. I didn't really dig into those in great detail. ADTCP we kind of talked about. The 16,470s and 464s, these are, again, zero access. Not unsurprising. Again, there's lots of them out there, a lot of them scanning. That's why these get pushed up into the top of the pile. 27015 is gaming related. Probably, I think this really comes into the pie chart here most often when there's a school break, notably college break. I would hazard to guess, this is me just prognosticating here, that probably within the next week or two, you're not going to see this on the list anymore as kids go back to school. Could be wrong about that. But
no, I think for the next week or two, you probably will see it with all the snow and the cold and school closings.
Well, I guess that's true. That's another factor I hadn't accounted for as well. But hopefully it doesn't stay so cold. I think some of us here in the Northeast and the Midwest and whatnot are kind of done with the cold weather. And we're not even like halfway through the winter yet. 8080 TCP, I talk about this one a lot. We know that Tomcat resides on this port. I always say Tomcat, Tomcat, Tomcat. If you have Tomcat and you're running it and you have the 8080 port, which is really the administrative interface for your Tomcat server to go update, add new JSPs and jars and whatnot into it, make sure that this is protected with a strong password and or filters so only those people that need to get access to it are able to. We know that there are certain actors out there that love Tomcat, and there's a special Tomcat JSP that they've created. It's called JSP RAT. We talked about RATs earlier in the program, remote administration toolkits. We talked about the Extreme RAT. We talked about Poison Ivy. Those are the ones that get deployed onto your PC, into Windows-based. There's something called JSP RAT. And there's probably a few others as well that I'm not even aware of. But if they can break into your Tomcat server, they can deploy this JSP RAT, which basically gives them remote administration, like full interactive remote administration, to your Unix server or Windows server that's running the Tomcat engine. So beware. We know that there are certain actors out there looking to do that. I think that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com. And you can also find us on Twitter at ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is also available at att.com/ThreatTraq and on YouTube. You can also subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes, so you can listen to it in your car or wherever as you go to work. So thanks again, Jim, for joining me today. Hopefully next week we'll have a few more people we can get in here. With the bad weather and everything, I think it's been tricky for us to have a full crew on staff for the show. But I'm hoping that gets better over the next couple of weeks here. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.